Some people think life is better than liberty, is better than pursuit of happiness, and somebody thinks pursuit of happiness is better than life, is better than liberty, and somebody thinks liberty is better than pursuit of happiness, is better than life.
There might be things that are just irreconcilably in conflict with each other. And what democratic institutions help us do is to actually justify choices that are sort of fundamentally flawed.
This is The Rip Current. I'm Jake Ward. We look at the big invisible forces, the currents that are threatening to sweep us all out to sea. They're the invisible forces that you really just can't spot unless you know what to look for, and that can really exhaust us and even drown us if we're not ready for them. We interview big experts in this kind of stuff, the invisible forces that are working on all of us. And this week I'm talking to a husband and wife mathematician, political science, double threat power duo, Elizabeth Penn and John Patti. They teach together at Emory University, and they also publish books together. I get into a whole conversation with them at the end of this conversation about how they get along as a couple and how you even do that without killing each other as husband and wife. But in the meantime, we also talk about their work, which I have to say I was really nervous going into this podcast because these two are really, really smart. They are trying to quantify some of the big weaknesses in democracy in a way that I just think is fascinating. I came to understand their work. Understand is not the right word. I barely understand their work because they're so smart. But I came to try to understand their work when I was writing my book, The Loop, How AI Creates a World Without Choices and How to Fight Back. And they taught me a lot about how little we understand about how democracy is really supposed to work, and how if we're going to start automating decisions, then we're going to need to also come to grips with all sorts of bigger democratic problems that we just barely are thinking about right now. So this conversation, we get into all of that as they have been sort of pivoting from what had been their focus on social choice and legitimacy, that's the title of their 2014 book that really blew my mind, into what are we going to do when AI is essentially making all of our choices for us. I think it's a really fascinating conversation. I learned a lot about democracy, about technology, and about how you get along as a married working couple. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with John Patti and Elizabeth Penn. John Patti and Elizabeth Penn, thank you so much for being here. I know you go by Maggie, though, right? If you're going to look you up online, we'll look you up as Elizabeth, but Maggie is how I'll call you. So thank you so much for being on the Rip Current. I really appreciate this. And when I describe your work, I was literally I was at a volleyball game on the sideline watching my kid play and was talking to parents last night, and they were asking me who I had coming up, and I was describing you guys. And the way I offhandedly describe it, and I want to do this for you because I want to hear whether you think I'm doing this right, is I basically say they're a husband and wife team, mathematician, political scientist, double threat, who wrote a book that for me really changed my mind about how things work, in that they basically showed that you can't fundamentally get your way in a democracy. The best we can hope for is that you can believe in the system and maybe sometimes get your way. And to me, that was like a really big breakthrough idea when I learned that. Like when you guys meet people at at Thanksgiving or whatever for the first time, and they say, "Oh, what do you guys write about?" How do you describe the in that offhand way that I'm trying to do?
That's a good question. I think your explanation's pretty on point.
Oh, thank God.
Yeah. So basically, what we try to explain to people is that imagine that you have like three teams, and each of them play each other once, and each of them beat one and lose to the other. Who's the best? And then people would come up with all sorts of different types of ways to justify one of them being the best. And our point in the book is to say, as long as we can explain how we broke that kind of tie, that's what democratic legitimacy is that people understand that why they lost, in a sense. Mm-hmm. I don't know if Maggie agrees with that.
Yeah, I think that's right. So we work in a tradition that's called social choice theory, in part. And so the new project we're working on, I hadn't really thought about how connected it is to the book that you've read, but a lot of it really focuses on the incompatibility of different types of goals and how we go about reconciling them. And this idea that in a democracy, the notion of a majority will when you're choosing among more than two things isn't actually well defined. So you can have situations where a majority of people prefer personal liberty to public safety, and a majority of people prefer public safety to economic, goodness, and then they prefer economic strength to liberty. And that can happen just out of normal votes that groups of individuals take without those individuals being irrational at all. And so our point is, how can we actually reconcile? If we make a choice, any choice we could make is going to lose to something else, but we're going to have to arrive at something. So how do we defend that?
So I think about if I think of like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I've heard people say before it's weird to have listed those with a comma and an and, because in fact, they're a little bit contradictory to each other.
All of them can be completely at odds with the other one. Yeah. That's a great example.
Riff on that for me for a second, because I think the theme of this hour is going to be me trying to keep up with you guys. So I can try and get my gears to turn on this as fast as they need to. Riff on that one for me. So life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Let's say you've got a group, of new Americans, right? Yeah. Saying that's those three are the thing, right? Why what is it that makes that so complicated? Why can't we just list those with a comma and an and?
Well, I've never really thought about those three. That's a good example. What my sort of quick take would be to sort of say, for social choice theory, the result that our first book is based on Arrow's theorem, for which Ken Arrow won a Nobel Prize, essentially it was motivated by this question of, can we expect a group of rational people to make choices as a group in the same way that a rational person would? And the answer is not, unless you basically choose a dictator. Otherwise, there's always this chance where some people think life is better than liberty, is better than pursuit of happiness, and somebody thinks pursuit of happiness is better than life, is better than liberty, and somebody thinks liberty is better than pursuit of happiness, is better than life.
And it makes me think of your book, actually, when you have the example of the heroin addict, your book, The Loop. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'll tell that anecdote. So, yes. There's that AI people that I've been talking to, we're talking about one of the problems they bump into is they say, okay, we're going to build an AI assistant that optimizes your life, makes it as good as it can possibly be. But you are addicted to heroin. So what is the AI supposed to do? Is it supposed to facilitate your addiction to heroin by making sure that it doesn't schedule any meetings for you early in the morning and makes sure it accounts for the fact that you're going to be a little junk sick at some point in the day? Or is it actively trying to get you off of heroin because it recognizes that in the main, that's the better option? And these AI people, who I think are really, my argument would be that almost across the board, the people think about AI, and I know we're going to get to algorithmic thinking because I know that's what you guys are starting to think about now in your new book. But I'd think it's like college freshmen bumping into the complications of the world for the very first time, and yet being given the godlike power to basically decide for us what's supposed to happen, right? So anyway, that's the anecdote that you're referring to, right?
Yeah, it's the anecdote, and it's this idea that these things might be completely incompatible. So in that case, that's a case where life is incompatible with liberty at some level, right?
Right.
And where both of those things might infringe upon someone else's pursuit of happiness, or so on.
What I remember when I was first being introduced to your work, before we knew each other, before I made direct contact with you, one thing that a couple of people sort of had said to me, and then you guys intimated this as well, is that what you write about, and in sort of, you mentioned Ken Arrow, who people won't know, but is, a bigwig in your field. Like, it seems to me that your theory and how you've been working on things would really piss people off in the sort of conventional political science world, in that there has always been this innocent assumption that we can come to a consensus in a democracy. We can make an agreement together, and that's why it's the best possible system around, and Like, just so that people sort of understand why what you're describing and have worked on all this time is disruptive. Can you tell us a little bit about what was the status quo, and why is this? One reviewer called this a thicker, what was the word? It was so good. A thicker conception of democracy is what one reviewer said in describing your work. What is the status quo, and how are you guys a disruption to that?
The status quo in political science.
Yeah, like what?
And yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, so there were sort of two pretty famous theories. So the first one was by Will Riker at the Rochester School, and he was one of the first political scientists that was really taking seriously these ideas about aggregation and the idea that you can have a majority of people preferring A to B and B to C and C to A. And his point was that actually, well, democracy can't do very much, maybe, other than sort of kicking the scoundrels out of office because of the fact that there is no majority will. And so therefore, it's just kind of a hopeless situation. And then other people stepped in and said, actually, maybe through conversations, maybe through deliberation, we can actually produce something called preference structuration, so that by talking to each other, maybe we can have our preferences align with each other. And maybe that's what democracy is. That's sort of a defense.
It's the West Wing, right? That's every scene of the West Wing is coming together. So the right speech and the right light at the right moment can bring us all together.
Yes. And that was Jerry Mackey and many other people kind of coming from a more philosophical tradition in political science. And so our point in the book, and I'll let John talk in a second, was that actually both of these are kind of not really giving democracy its due. There isn't a majority will necessarily. There might be things that are just irreconcilably in conflict with each other. And what democratic institutions help us do is to actually justify choices that are sort of fundamentally flawed, because any choice is going to have to be kind of fundamentally flawed in some way. And so
I just want to let that sink in for a second, because it's a really important thing you're saying. You're saying not democracy is complicated, but we can work to a consensus if we spend enough time on it. You're basically saying there are literally irreconcilable differences that are going to occur in a democracy that we will never work out, except in as much as we will come to some sort of consensus that we're going to put this aside and let this rule the day. But someone's getting left out.
Someone's
basically.
getting left out, and by actually acknowledging sort of who that is and why that is, that's really what the goal is. And so
that's the best hope we have.
And so when I think about, we hadn't really thought. So we've been working on different stuff, and this book came out in 2014. We hadn't thought about it too much in light of the current things that are happening. But it was really interesting to me after getting your email, thinking about what it says about politics today.
It's been tripping me out. I literally talk about your book every day on what's happening right now. And the idea that we have, we talk about, we're so polarized, which I agree. But what's so interesting to me is that as I say to everybody, I feel like I only understand a fraction of what you have tried to communicate in that book and in your work. But from what tiny sliver I have understood, it feels to me like what you're saying is the polarization has always, the polarization isn't the thing. We just have lost the mechanism we used to have, or have maybe sometimes had, of working through to the end, not achieving consensus, but at least maintain. So John, maybe you could help us understand about where this notion of legitimacy, why that's sort of why that's in the title of the book, and what's so core about that, or anything else. I don't want to direct you.
No, that's directly on point, and also relevant to your great question a few minutes ago about where this fits within political science, social science in general.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's a little in the weeds, but when this result is described in most classes, it's framed as a result about elections, about electoral systems. And our point in the book, that's sort of, again, a little in the weeds, is actually that the result doesn't have anything to do specifically with elections. And so Riker, that Maggie mentioned earlier, he was thinking that elections were the only way to judge whether something was the best outcome. And so our point was that actually there's more information in here in terms of when you can't say one of them's the best, you can sort of trace a path to say, but this is why we decided that this one was the best today. So that was joining with that more law and philosophy side that Maggie brought. We're trying to merge these literatures because, as we're seeing today, very sadly relevant,
right.
The shadow docket and all of the Supreme Court decisions and the Trump administration, they're breaking the norm that I think most people thought was the virtue of the judiciary, which was a long reasoned process, that the opinion comes down and it acknowledges We could have done that. The reason we're not doing that today is this. And that's something that we think is that's what's disturbing, at least me right now, about the moment. And when our students come up and neighbors and ask, I say, well, the one thing that's very different right now is that it doesn't seem like either side seems to be interested in offering an explanation. And that's sort of like being willing to create a compromise too. So you say, like, why this compromise?
And the thing that I was, so I was thinking about these different issues, these kind of polarizing issues like affirmative action and abortion and trans girls in sports and so on. And part of what I feel is really bad about many of the conversations we have about them is that I think these are really interesting issues. They're issues that touch on fundamental values that many Americans have. And these are values we have inside us that might be in conflict with each other in us. And a lot of the debates on both sides aren't acknowledging the fact that these are important values that they're touching on that are in conflict, and that there are good arguments on many different sides of these important issues.
You could imagine. I mean, again, it's like I can't believe I keep pulling it back to this, but you can imagine a rich and nuanced episode of The West Wing on almost any of those topics, where at the end they come together for a very reasonable, conversation and consensus about it. But yeah, we're not even in that space of, there is no dialogue. Aaron Sorkin's not taking a swing at that script. There is no conversation going on, and no explanation of this difficult choice we have come to make, which I think is so interesting. So what you guys remind me of is I had this really interesting experience with a project at Stanford that was looking at the ways in which motorists stopped by police were so consistently treated differently depending on their race. And it was so consistent that when they fed the conversations between the police officer and the motorist into what at the time was a pretty simple like language recognition system, this was pre LLMs, the system could recognize what was the system could recognize the race of the motorist based on how they were being talked to, even if it didn't know what the race was, because that's how consistent it was. Anyway, the point of this is to say, well, one of the things that was super, super triggering and was a pattern, again, in the triggering and the escalation of the conversation each time, was that the motorist, when the motorist was white, the police officer was much more likely to explain why they had stopped them. And there was a reasoned conversation about, I pulled you over because your taillight is out or whatever it is. With a black motorist, they very rarely explained what was going on and why they'd been pulled over. And that the refusal to do so, even after being asked, why have you stopped me? Why am I in trouble? The refusal to answer that question led to this incredible escalation each time. Because there's something, and I think this sort of jives with what you're saying, there's something fundamental in human nature that we want to hear.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Go with me on that one. Like, what is that?
It's in line with so many different parts of the academy, from law to psychology to sort of business and human resources. There's tons and tons of great research that show that two aspects of what some people call procedural legitimacy are so important. The first is transparency of, like, why am I being interrogated? Like, why are you making me not do what I was going to do normally? And the second is the right to appeal, and having that be very clear. And obviously that's clearly at the heart of the current executive branch versus judicial branch regarding the deportations,